Take a step outside of your door and then take a cursory glance at the world around you. Look at the people. They're different. Some people are taller. Some people are shorter. Some people have brown hair, black hair. Some people have blonde hair. Some people have vaginas. And some people have penises. And among all these differences, it is not just entirely possible, but absolutely the case that these various individuals that you're looking at, that are obviously different in their presentation and their appearance, probably almost certainly at the individual level differ in their abilities to engage in abstract thinking and solve problems. It might be the case that one guy over there is really good at solving algebra problems, and the other guy at the opposite end of the street is terrible. Or that person over there is really fast, but the other person can run marathons. There are all these differences, right? And all these differences are caused almost entirely by genes. Now, we are living right now in an era where gene editing as a procedure is not science fiction. I repeat, it is not science fiction. Complex genetic engineering kind of is, but it lies on the horizon. We can see it, and some of you folk that are younger than I am will live to see it. Complex genetic engineering. It's less science fiction than things like the artificial womb, and it's less science fiction, certainly, than things like boom tubes or exploring different galaxies. And that is why we need to talk about this. That's also why it's imperative that we get a handle on this and how we proceed with this technology, because I truly believe that this potentially could be the most life-altering, in a positive sense, technology that has ever come to light in the course of humanity. That is no exaggeration. There are many pieces of technology that have aided man in his quest to enjoy a better life, to conquer the world, that have embedded him in survival. But this, whilst doing all of these things potentially, gives us something else that we've never had before. A sense of control that is actually consequential versus all the other things that we have done hitherto, the platitudes we engage in, the policies, etc., etc. All those amount to naught when you consider the implications of genetic engineering or gene editing. Why do some people in life do better than others? It's an age-old question. And until comparatively recently, we didn't know the answer. Philosophers mused about it, and other people attribute it to the gods, or God. But for the first time we know, we have these things called genes, and that our DNA leads us down certain paths, and makes certain paths wholly inaccessible to certain individuals. We know this now, although simultaneously we exist in a world where we deny this. I say we very broadly because I'm not including myself in this or you in the audience, but the confrontation of reality with people's well-wishing and ideals is a serious issue that's been addressed multiple times on this channel. But the perspective here is simple. Genes matter. They matter more than anything else. They actually matter more than your environment, for reasons we'll go into. But put it this way. Although gene expression is very important, it's not as important as the genes you have, because the genes you have set you up for certain limitations. And yes, it is nice that a gene might be positively expressed in one way, but wouldn't you rather have the potential to achieve great things due to your genes, irrespective of the gene expression? And to my point just prior, the environment is a bit of a meme, because most of the things that affect your genes, the gene expression, are the result of stochasticity, randomness, things that are unpredictable, that you could have never known and never planned for. These things, above all, interact with your genes more than anything else, not the carefully crafted and shaped protocols of those who plan for education, or even what your parents delude themselves into thinking, because genes help to craft a certain environment. The environment your parents have created is a result of their own genetic contributions. And this is why the environment is a bit of a meme. The only area in which the environment typically has a massive impact is the negative aspect of the environment. Just as you can smash a television to pieces using a hammer or a baseball bat, whichever tool you wish to avail yourself of to achieve this, so too can you smash, bash, and ruin a person's life. It is easy to break someone. It is very difficult to elevate somebody. This is known in the field of genetics, although many people will deny this, and those who are aware but have ideological commitments will not deny this outright, but will do everything in their power to cover up this truth. So the environment is a bit of a meme. Furthermore, to the extent that the environment matters, and it matters to some degree, it matters the most when you're incredibly young, not when you're in your 20s, certainly not when you're in your 30s or 40s. And to buttress my earlier point about genes shaping the environment, there is the concept coined by Richard Dawkins in the 1980s, in a book that invokes the very name of the concept itself, the extended phenotype, which suggests that genes have an effect on more than just the physical manifestation of the organism in question, but also have an effect on the environment and what that environment looks like. So it's very much the case that particular parents, due to their genes, have an environment that you could view as the extended phenotype of those genes, thus creating a certain type of household, and the children themselves related to the parents grow up in this household, with some similarities and some differences. The parent in kind responds to the inclinations and impulses of the child. If the child is meant to be a jock, he probably will discover sport, and his parents in turn will send him to Little League, or football, or wherever it might be. This is how the environment actually works. It is an extension of our genes, setting aside the stochastic and or random effects of the path you walk in life. So, for example, many years ago when I was an undergraduate, I wanted to be a historian, and I had a history professor that told me if I wish to be a historian, I need to, at the very least, learn German, learn to read it, at the very, very least. And that put me on a quest. A random encounter, unpredictable, and lo and behold, it became an incredibly important part of my life. By far the foreign language I speak best, although I speak several, and the German language has a great meaning to me on a personal level. That is an environmental effect that has changed my brain quite literally, going from speaking no German to speaking it completely fluently, and yet you couldn't have predicted it. What if I had not taken that Western civilization class? What if I had not spoken with the professor? It's entirely possible that I would have never discovered German, and that I never would have been put on the trajectory that I ended up walking. And who knows how I would have turned out. I'm not a particularly content person, and of the things in my life, one of the things that I certainly do not regret is my engagement with the German language. But how did that come to pass? I don't know. It was also at this time, through stochastic measures, mind you, that I discovered that I had an above-average aptitude of foreign languages. I was never exposed to it growing up, certainly not in the typical American scholastic system. I was a late bloomer, as it were, starting at around age 20, although prior to that I had studied Latin. And what do you know? Stochastic intervention, not predictable. So much for the environment. It is a bit of a myth that the environment is this infinitely malleable and predictable thing, as many people are wont to claim, and as many people will claim to you. It is simply not true. The environment that matters most is the environment we have the least influence on and the least control over. Because one of the obstacles, and we haven't even gotten to the point of genetic engineering just yet, that we will run up against, and run up against currently, in the current year, as they like to say, is this notion that the environment is so much more important than genes. And even at times the outright denial of the importance of genes. Where does this conceit come from is the question. And I maintain with relative certainty that this conceit stems from the fears of people that conceding the potency, power, and relevance, which is undeniable of genes, means making a concession to the uncontrollable. Because at the end of the day, despite how often I might claim that you need to choose the right parents, which is obviously a jest, you cannot do that. And so the only tool left in the arsenal of effecting change to the minds of the masses, this infinitely malleable and amorphous tool that you can reshape at a whim to achieve the best results possible, genes not included. But as I've demonstrated, we actually don't have very good control over the environment. Think about it. If the household that you are raised in is a projection, i.e., an extended phenotype of the genotype of your parents, is that in fact a malleable environment? Almost certainly not. If the most important factor in terms of the environment boils down to the vicissitudes of life, of whether or not X event occurs or Y event does not, is that an example of control over the environment? I think not. So in reality, we have control at the current moment of neither our genes nor our environment. And the problem is, and I'm not the first person to point this out, by the time we are adults, aware enough to do something about our environment, to implement changes in our lives, we have all along been pushed relentlessly in a particular direction by our genes, without fail. And so the habits you've built up will become, at times, nigh impossible to change. Impossible, no, it really comes down to the individual. As I've alluded to many times during the course of my videos, as you know, why does the one alcoholic succeed at quitting the bottle, but the other does not? Why does the one rare individual lose weight and manage to keep it off for the rest of his life, but the vast majority of people yo-yo up and down, and many people never lose weight? These are mysteries that ought to be unraveled, but they ultimately come down to genes. Personality is yet another thing affected by our genes, which certainly will have an impact on something like substance abuse and our ability to control our intake of food. So I believe that I've sufficiently driven home the point that whatever the environment ultimately is, it is not the infinitely malleable Play-Doh that people above all on the left would have you believe, or arguably the general populace. Most people believe that the environment is the primary shaper of who you are as a person, and that you can do much with it to change yourself and become somebody fundamentally different from who you used to be. There is almost no evidence to support that belief, unfortunately, if you look at the literature, if you look at these factors. And again, to hammer home the point one last time, to the extent that the environment is important, it is not really within our control. Not to the degree that people believe, at the very least. Why am I talking about all of this? Because as I mentioned earlier in the video, we are truly standing on the precipice of something that, up until now, was completely impossible. Because if the game of life is largely determined by genes, and then by a largely uncontrollable environment, what would be the best course of action? The best course of action would be to give people the genetic tools that allow them to do well in life. What does it mean to be insufficient? To be insufficient means that you don't meet the mark, you don't meet the standard, you don't succeed. Lack of success redounds unto itself, creating such things as the negative Matthew effect loop, which we've talked about many times. Success, on the other hand, redounds to a positive effect in your life, the positive Matthew effect loop. What largely determines these things? Your genes. If you're a hideous, unattractive, and short person, above all as a man, you have obstacles that for an average person are inconceivable, just as a very normal-looking person can only imagine, vaguely, what it might be like to be a Chad. But also your ability to work certain jobs, your ability to understand problems, all of these things. I don't need to go into all the technical details right now. Maybe I'll make a separate video about this, but generally speaking, people find that rather boring, so I might not. Nonetheless, the things that matter most to us in life, success, acceptance, achievement, etc., these things are determined by your genes. And therefore, if we have the ability to intervene at the level of the genome, to genetically re-engineer ourselves, and above all, to intervene in the lives of those who've been genetically disadvantaged, such that their offspring will not share in those disadvantages, do we not have a moral obligation in some sense? For all the shrill caterwauling of the left and progressives, and their claims of wanting to uplift people and to help people, this is anathema to them. It is toxic, it is evil, it is eugenic. On the matter of eugenics, there's much to say. I'll talk a little bit about it. Generally speaking, eugenics is simply the effort of an organism to optimize the genetic outcomes of its offspring. It has nothing to do with the pseudo-scientific political programs of the days of yore in the 20th century. Every time an attractive, intelligent person rejects an ugly, unintelligent person, they're engaging in, quote-unquote, eugenics. Only the reality is everyone does that, and people have to accept that. That's okay. Now, what people mean, as I said, conventionally, is some kind of state-enforced insanity that wasn't even particularly related to genes, to be perfectly honest, and has nothing to do with the natural protocols of human beings seeking to optimize genetic outcomes in terms of their offspring. Absolutely nothing to do with it. And I don't need to address that issue much further, because that's the bulk of it, and it has now been addressed. Indeed, this is the reason why the left won't touch the topic of genetics and improving people's lives with a 10-foot pole. They're terrified, and I'm not sure if they actually believe this, that we will recreate a landscape identical to the events of World War II, canonically at least the worst event to ever befall humanity. So they won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. It is radioactive. And so instead they resort to platitudes about the environment and education, and things that, frankly speaking, don't have a terribly massive effect on the outcomes of individual children. What did have a massive effect on the children who succeeded was they had the right combination of genes, coupled by the right series of concatenated events, i.e., random events, that allowed them to succeed. There's always a question of degree here. It's difficult for us, stuck in our own minds and bodies, to imagine how difficult a life might be if we don't partake of that life. It's why the vast majority of Chads and hyper-successful, hyper-intelligent individuals have little compassion, understanding, or even ability to relate to people below their rank, because it doesn't affect them. Likewise, if you're an average person who can nonetheless navigate the basics of life, you probably don't know what it's like to attempt to navigate life with, say, a 75 IQ. The amount of obstacles that lie in wait if you have a 75 IQ for daily functionality, for the ability to just get through the day, understand things. These obstacles are immense, difficult to relate to if you're of average intelligence or slightly above average intelligence. Such individuals struggle understanding cause and effect, why they're in the situation they are, and why not. And they unfortunately lack the capacity to find solutions. And they are shunned precisely because of this genetic disadvantage. Other people do not want to engage with them. In addition to cognitive impairment, they might display any number of correlative or associated personality traits that are not beneficial to the thriving of an individual. Low impulse control, criminality, crassness, boorishness. And so, such an individual really has the deck stacked against him. And most people will not want to engage with that because it's unrelatable. And, frankly speaking, such an individual can be thoroughly unpleasant. Through no intention of his own, he simply was made that way by forces outside of his control. Now imagine a world in which we could actually help such an individual. We could, and this is, at the current moment in time, a piece of science fiction, but imagine, if you will, we could give the individual with a 75 IQ a 125 IQ. And we could give him different personality traits in addition. We could amplify his conscientiousness. We could increase his impulse control, which, again, is highly correlated with things like IQ. How much better a life could such an individual lead than his current life? The same applies to many different things. You see, I believe sincerely that it is ethically and morally wrong to not pursue this technology in an effort to aid people and uplift them. Now, yes, in terms of medical interventions, everyone is on board with curing these things vis-a-vis genetic techniques, cystic fibrosis, greater propensities for breast cancer, sickle cell anemia, etc., etc. Medical stuff, everyone's on board with that. The other stuff, not so much. And why? Because of the fear that we will reenact World War II all over again. Now, in places like Scandinavia, in particular Denmark and Iceland, they have all but eliminated Down syndrome babies as a possibility for offspring. And here is where the rubber meets the road in terms of these concerns. Because let's be honest, as I sort of intimated before, a person of limited cognitive ability struggles throughout his life. A person with Down syndrome will struggle throughout his life to deal with things. He will not be fully functional. And parents wanting healthy and functional offspring then opt preemptively to make sure that such children never see the light of day. This is controversial because of the almost axiomatic belief that all life has identical value. Not even really a religious conviction, because in Scandinavia they're not particularly religious. And I recall a while back reading an article about how something like 95% of Down syndrome babies are eliminated preemptively in Denmark, how the few women who chose to have them secretly admitted and acknowledged that they had regretted their decisions, and they felt all the more awful for it. In Iceland, a small country of no more than 300,000 people, no such babies are born anymore. They are screened out of existence. So the question is, where do we draw the line between health, medical condition, and something else? Everyone agrees that cystic fibrosis, which affects the lungs and the respiratory system, is a horrible and deadly illness, so it should be done away with. Not so many people about Down syndrome. And what about, in the long term, people that don't have the potential to be truly successful in life? I'm not a successful person. I'm of middling intelligence, somewhat above average, nor do I have high conscientiousness, and I'm very average looking at best. Also not very tall. My life would have been magnitudes better if I had been taller, more attractive, smarter, with high conscientiousness. So the question here is, where do we draw the line between something that's regarded entirely as an illness and therefore a disadvantage, i.e. cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia, versus on the extreme end, people that are mildly functional but never have the potential to actually succeed massively, as some people do, and everything in between, including the potential of Down syndrome babies. This is murky territory that we cannot have a discussion about. We cannot even have a discussion about it because of the pernicious and limiting woke politics of the day. Because again, if we talk about it, we will somehow reenact the events of World War II, because that's what always happens, does it not? If the technology is available to help people to become better human beings with more potential for themselves, to achieve the things almost all human beings want, as I've already mentioned, acceptance, success, contentment, then you would be an absolute monster in moral terms to deny such tools to individuals who are struggling. And yet that is precisely what the Academy does, precisely what the progressive politics of the day tend to do. And all of this is interlocking. I have a gene variant that predisposes me for all sorts of terrible, deadly illnesses, and most people would be on board with fixing that. But it's not ultimately separate from this other issue. Disadvantages throughout life compound and make people miserable. People are miserable not through their own doing, but because they got really bad genetic hands. And the environment that was created for them, by dint of the extended phenotype, then adds fuel to the fire. And thus they fail. But we refuse to do what is absolutely necessary, to my mind, to actually improve people's lives, which would first entail tripling, quadrupling, quintupling the amount of money invested in genetic research, not just for clear-cut illnesses, but for matters of intelligence, personality, looks. What are the genes, for example, involved in creating a very symmetrical face? We don't know. And God's forbid if you're curious about that. The NIH now, the National Institute of Health, actively blocks geneticists from accessing information about intelligence as related to genes. Because again, everyone knows that if people start looking into these things, somehow we will reenact World War II. It's always the same point. And yet these people are actually monstrous because by not doing these things, they are condemning people in the now, but above all people of the future, to lives of incompetence and misery, all the while trying to virtue signal that they're not doing so. If such individuals actually cared about people, as they are wont to claim, all evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, they would do that. Because the best way to uplift people is to improve their genetic lot. It's a fact. It's something we need to come to terms with. Now, this would be pure science fiction if none of this were on the table, if CRISPR didn't exist, and other gene editing techniques didn't exist. It would just be pie in the sky, but it's not pie in the sky anymore. It's not. There's another good that would come from genetically uplifting disadvantaged individuals, and that is the externalities that would redound to the benefit of all. If millions and millions became more conscientious, more intelligent, better looking, you would get more productivity, more creativity. The world probably would improve. Someone could almost think, in most sinister fashion, that the people at the top don't want other people to compete with them. They want the masses to stay down where they are. It's all just rhetoric. Maybe that's true, I don't know. But they certainly don't care about the lot of the average person, much less the lot of the less than average person. And yet they will bang on and on and on and endlessly about various ineffectual and pointless environmental exercises that we know have almost no positive effect or correlation with positive life outcomes. Because usually by then it's too late, past a certain threshold, and again, you cannot control for stochasticity. Because life just throws things at you, and your genes then interact with those things that are thrown at them. Now think about this. By any normative, ethical, moral standard, would you not be a monster if you had the power to improve a person's life, to give him the tools to not only navigate life better, but to be hugely successful in life, to be content, to be accepted and wanted? Would you not be a moral monster to deny that individual such tools? Absolutely, by any normative standard. If you say, I hereby condemn you to a life of unachievement, of lack of acceptance, of bewilderment, of addiction, of failure, you would be a monster if you had the choice in the matter. And yet, these days we very much stand upon the precipice of that choice. It is within reach. It lies on the horizon. And if we cannot batter down these walls of the current ideology, of the politics of the day, of wokeism, of the very denial of reality, then we will be condemning potentially, untold numbers of people to continued misery and failure throughout their lives. And guess what? If people don't do it in the United States, they will do it elsewhere, albeit for selfish reasons. The Chinese are not going to genetically engineer their population because they're altruistic. They're going to genetically re-engineer their population because they know it will produce good results and it will boost their economy, boost their society, and allow them to get ahead. And similar such things apply to places like Singapore, South Korea, Japan, any place that is sufficiently advanced but has none of these bizarre compunctions that we're so obsessed with in the West that prevent us from actually helping people. These people are moral monsters. Yes, they are. They don't want to help people. They want to condemn people to lives of misery because they refuse to accept reality. How many people's lives could be improved if they were smarter, better looking, more conscientious? And they could actually achieve things that they can't even dream of right now because their cognitive horizon is so limited through no fault of their own. Yes, I am saying this. The people who deny reality, who don't want to push for this type of technology, who do not want to push for genetic engineering to improve people's lives, they are moral monsters. They are moral monsters, and they hate human beings. They don't want to help people. Clearly not. And yet, they are at the reins of power. It's all just rhetoric. They would rather uphold their stupid, pernicious, silly ideology, which is life-denying, reality-denying, than to stoop so low as to actually help people by pushing for the things that are necessary. Like I said, quintuple investment in genetic research. Open discussion about human differences such that we can learn in order to even out the gap so we can actually bloody help people for once in our pathetic existence as Homo sapiens. We actually have the means to do something, and these people refuse to do it. They don't want to help you. They don't want to help me. They don't actually want to help the poor and disadvantaged. They just want to spew rhetoric about what might be done vis-a-vis the environment, which has thus far yielded almost no good results. These are hateful people. They hate humanity because they refuse to confront themselves with the reality of humanity. Insufficiency in life is one of the most damning qualities any individual can have. It condemns such individuals to lives of utter misery, of misunderstanding, of inescapability. Why would you not want to turn insufficiency into sufficiency? Unless you're a moral monster that actually wants people to suffer, to know their place, and to not be better than their accorded lot due to the genetic lottery. I can't think of any other reason other than this absurd fear that by merely talking about these things, by researching these things in an effort to help people, somehow, some way, we will reenact all the events of World War II, and it will just be World War II/National Socialism 2.0. Always these extremes, right? This is something I talk about frequently with a friend. It's either the most extreme thing or nothing at all. There's nothing in between. It's just impossible. If we do genetic research into intelligence and personality and improving people's looks, what will result from that? Well, of course, World War II, right? We will simply reenact those events. So rather than talking about it, we pretend that everyone is the same, that we can all achieve exactly the same things, despite mountains and mountains of evidence to the contrary. Had I been born later in life, would have loved to have benefited from the amazing and wondrous features of gene editing and genetic engineering that is almost certainly within reach and does not belong entirely to the realm of science fiction. No, Johnny, we want you to fail. We want you to be dumb and short and unattractive and not achieve anything. That's what we want. We want you to struggle with your lot accorded to you by the fickleness of the gods. That's what it sounds like. Let me make a final point here. The way you improve reality and the inhabitants of reality, namely us, human beings, is not by denying reality. You don't build a bridge and make it efficient by ignoring the principles of physics and engineering, any more than you make people better, improve their lives by ignoring the basis of their lives, their genes. You cannot improve reality by ignoring it. Of course, I'm but a lone voice in a vast wilderness. No one will listen to me on this matter. It doesn't really matter. It's important to state on principle. If people don't want to aid people, not just for clear-cut illnesses in a genetic sense, but make them smarter, more attractive, more fortitudinous in terms of their personality, if people don't want that, because they are condemning those people to lives of insufficiency, misery, and failure, and they will suffer greatly for it. Apparently, yes, that is what they want for those people, all to satisfy their bizarre and deluded chimera that if we talk about this and actually try to improve people's lives, we will just reenact World War II and everything will happen just as it did back then. That is the belief, that is the claim, patently absurd, but there you have it. If you want to help people who inhabit reality, and we all do, you don't ignore reality. Reality is unforgiving, and by ignoring it, we make people's lives even worse. We have to uplift people genetically, and we can only do that by accepting the reality that genes are the most important thing in people's lives. And the minute we have access to technology that allows us to do this efficiently, safely, cleanly, we cannot ignore the moral obligation to do so. These people would. These people would prevent that from happening. And for that reason, they are moral monsters. I will repeat it one last time. If you want to improve reality, you have to accept reality. That's just how these things work. This was a bit of a long one, gentlemen. Thank you for bearing with me up until now. But as always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons who make such videos possible. You guys are much appreciated. And if you want to support the channel, you can become a patron. Or if you're not so inclined, show some support on PayPal. And if you engage in the usual YouTube jazz of liking the video, commenting, subscribing, sharing it, etc., much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out next time. Until then, may those ever so fickle gods watch over you, because right now that's all we have. All we have is the fickleness of the gods. But we could do so much better than that. Let's hope that we actually manage to make it. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.